Excited as everyone was for the war to be over, the cost was immense. There was massive loss, mass death, mass destruction. The economies of all Europe practically ceased to exist. Rationing and shortages had begun during the war, but they didn't end when it did. The United Kingdom had funded the war through very heavy borrowing and through very heavy taxation. Over the course of those few years, they had to sell off many of their overseas assets. If the First World War had deteriorated their empire, then now it was on its deathbed. Over the course of the war, their debt level had gone from 110% debt to GDP to 240%. Because of the large welfare state funded by debt, poverty wasn't felt immediately, but as their economy transitioned from wartime back to peace, everyone began to feel it. Everyone began to feel that Britain had been destroyed. France and the Netherlands were worse. France lost 3 times its annual national income and had suffered so many deaths that they couldn't even run a normal economy. There was massive physical damage. From the years of 1945 to 1948, inflation ran at about 50% for them. The Dutch economy had contracted to 27% of its pre-war level. During the war, they had been compelled to overproduce their currency for the German war effort. After the war, sticking them with heavy inflation. Nearly 27 to 40% of their capital stock had been destroyed. There was massive debt, poverty, and destruction. Germany wasn't even its own country anymore. After the war, it immediately spiraled into hyperinflation. There was mass poverty and famine. The destruction was immense, and even if they wanted to rebuild, much of their capital stock had been taken by the Soviets. Their country was divided into occupation zones, with an Anglo American and French side, and a Soviet side. As the United States transitioned out of its wartime economy, and pent-up demand was unleashed, it too suffered high inflation, although it was very mild by comparison. In 1946, American inflation only ran at about 8%. There was a brief economic contraction during the transition period, but after that, America began its greatest economic boom period ever experienced, perhaps by any country ever. To fund the war, the United Kingdom raised taxes significantly. It pursued loans and issued bonds, all facilitated by the Bank of England, as well as the major City of London banks. Britain had been dependent on American financing for some time, but by 1945, a post-war Anglo American loan was given to them. $3.75 billion from the United States and Canada. The United States began to look around. It saw everyone in Europe poor. It on an island of prosperity. It feared what this deprivation might mean. It feared that it might mean communism. In 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall would give a speech at Harvard, proposing a European self-help program financed by the United States. Nations of Europe would meet to discuss this idea. The Soviets would be invited, but they declined. Thus, in 1948, the Marshall Plan was born. The United States had achieved true financial dominance. In July of 1944, it became evident that Britain wouldn't be able to afford its debts. Though there was an international Anglo American political class, that didn't mean national interests were completely gone. The Americans looked around and realized, we are on top. Wanting to both create the liberal international order that Roosevelt and Churchill had envisioned, and to avoid the problems from after the First World War, leaders of national economies would meet to design the post-war global order. They would meet at Bretton Woods. There they would establish the International Monetary Fund, which would effectively be the institution that would oversee their new monetary order. It would attempt to ensure exchange rate stability, facilitate international payments, provide temporary financial assistance via loans, and be financed by contributions from member nations. They would as well develop the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which is now part of the World Bank. It would serve as an international development bank. They would as well develop the Bretton Woods system of exchange rates. Member currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. It would also be stipulated that member currencies must be mutually convertible. They were designing the economic and financial system of the Anglo American liberal world order. The United States, for its part, had just developed their own new internal financial system. The Banking Acts of 1933 and 1935 would turn the regional banking network that was the Federal Reserve Network into the entity functionally indistinguishable from a central bank that it is today. The modern Federal Reserve had come from a long history of efforts to both create and to uncreate a central bank for the United States. In 1791, with backing from Alexander Hamilton, the first Bank of the United States was created. This would serve as the first attempt for an American central bank. It was opposed fiercely by both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It was short-lived, however, as its charter was not renewed in 1811. 5 years later, the Second Bank of the United States would be created. There had been an over-proliferation of banknotes, and thus the currency inside the United States had become very unstable. Yet President Andrew Jackson would ultimately veto its recharter, and so its charter would lapse in 1832. The United States would go without a central bank for quite some time. In 1863, in a response to the Civil War, the national banking system was created. The national banking system would create a uniform national currency, and nationally chartered banks regulated by the comptroller of the currency. These banks would be required to hold U.S. bonds to back their notes. Yet, it still wasn't a true central bank, and it couldn't act as a lender of last resort. It was more a system of tightly regulated banks. In 1910, the Jekyll Island meeting of prominent American financiers would take place. Figures like Paul Warburg, Frank Vanderlip, and Benjamin Strong would attend, where they would conceive of a national banking network. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act would be passed. Now, many people who oppose the Fed assume that this is when the Federal Reserve, as we think of it, was created. It was not. At this point, it was a network of regional banks, each genuinely owned and influenced by their shareholding member banks, and each with their own unique interest rate. The idea was simple, that a farmer in Iowa and a broker in New York shouldn't have the same rate. And recall when I mentioned the gentleman's agreement between Montague Norman and Benjamin Strong. Benjamin Strong was not the chairman of the Fed. He was the governor of the New York Fed. That is because, at that point, the chairman of the Federal Reserve was a fairly unimportant role. He was more a vague overseer of the network. The governors had all the real power. It was distributed, and each region was genuinely autonomous. Yet, after the banking acts of the Roosevelt administration, we get the Fed we know and love today. The all-powerful one big New York Fed, with the powerful chairman and the monolithic Fed funds rate. This gave the centralized Board of Governors power to set reserve requirements, set discount rates, and created a centralized Fed Open Market Committee, which was authorized to do open market operations. Prior to the banking acts, the Federal Reserve System existed to transact in the commercial paper market. It was private sector securities that it would be tasked with. Yet after the acts, it would be given the role of buying and selling treasury securities, becoming much more like the Bank of England and the financier of the American Treasury. The first chairman of this era would be Mariner Eccles. He was supported by Henry Morgenthau and appointed by Roosevelt. Although John Maynard Keynes hadn't yet published his book, their ideas were very similar. He believed in a highly interventionist government and Fed that should act contracyclically to the economy, deficit spend in bad economic times, and run a surplus with high taxes in good economic times. That perhaps through constant intervention, we could get rid of market cycles, which didn't happen. But now there was an all-powerful centralized Fed, an IMF, a development bank, a new monetary order under the control of Anglo American liberals, and near total financial hegemony. This would be the most one faction would ever have control over the entire world ever. It wouldn't get more extensive than this. So, the liberal international order would set to work and begin rebuilding Europe. Britain was in a difficult situation. Though its Imperial faction had successfully executed the Anglo American vision, transferring much of the Imperial system to the United States, there were some real financial problems. The large Anglo American loan was dangling over the heads of the government. Westminster had become an enormous U.S. debtor. As a condition of the Anglo American loan, the sterling would become available for current account transactions by July 1947. Once this happened, the dollar reserves of the United Kingdom would be rapidly drained, as countries would convert their pounds for dollars. Britain was forced to suspend this convertibility within weeks, the government grabbing every dollar they could. In 1949, Britain began devaluing the sterling, hoping that this could address the balance of payments deficit and make their exports more competitive. Throughout the early 1950s, they'd continue to use exchange controls. The Soviets, fearing potential confiscation of their dollar deposits, began placing their dollars in non-US banks, particularly in Soviet-owned banks in London, such as Moscow Narodny. In the United States, Regulation Q placed a ceiling on the interest rate payable on domestic deposits. This began to make offshore deposits more attractive. At the same time, The US was running a balance of payments deficit, causing US dollars to leave the country. Many of these dollars began to land in England. In 1957, the UK imposed new restrictions on pound-denominated credit for non-residents and banned the use of the pound to finance third-party trade. Some of the banks of London began to notice an opportunity. They could use dollar deposits to finance foreign trade and to lend to non-residents. One bank often cited with being a progenitor of this idea is Midland. These banking families had gone back centuries. They had been on top of the world's greatest empire, the wealthiest and most dominant people on the planet. They built up the Anglo American order. Now they were not going to allow their banks to get squeezed out. And thus, a market for US dollar loans began to emerge in London. British banks would offer loans denominated in US dollars, regardless of whether they had adequate US Treasury reserves. It's holding treasuries that makes a dollar, but they would simply say, "This is a dollar." But it wasn't. It was a Eurodollar. This offshore dollar lending market would rapidly expand in the 1960s. In 1963, the first Eurobond was issued, which is a foreign bond denominated in dollars. Throughout the 70s, this market would grow. In 1971, the Bretton Woods system would end. The proliferation of floating rate instruments made the Eurodollar market even more substantial, and by the 1980s, the Eurodollar market put these banks back on top, rebuilding their financial empire. Franklin Roosevelt had ushered in an era of a large and powerful administrative state, a European-style central bank, and the hegemony of the Anglo American liberal world order. Yet while he and his administration were surrounded by the think tanks and powerful factions that dominated the British Empire, he did have some reservations toward the power center of London, the power of finance, and the colonial system of Britain. In some regards, he brought the United States into the British imperial system, yet he guarded other aspects, and was resistant. However, after his death, a death that some found rather suspicious, the powerful force of that one man was gone, and nobody had true control over this vast apparatus. Perhaps Roosevelt didn't want a vast imperial system dominated by the bankers of London and Europe. Yet the tools that he created were perfect for such an entity. And with him gone, and Truman as president, the 20th century would fall right into the hands of the administrative state, the intelligence agencies, and the imperial financiers of the City of London. Now with the birth of the Eurodollar, the centuries-old financial empire was more powerful than it had ever been.